As temperatures drop, there's a new awareness. Fur really is dead, as one fashion house after the other drops fur. The decades-long battle means victory. For real. PETA's Dan Mathews on how your activism saved the animals. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights changed their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, a victory for PETA and the animals achieved.
It took longer than we hoped, but it has happened. And I think alarming them, making them nervous to even put on a fur fashion show through the threat of disruptions was very instrumental. And then I think, as with all of these things, it's a generational change. They realized it wasn't just a trend among some young people, but that most of the new generation thought fur was revolting, and it wasn't just a passing trend.
Dan Mathews, PETA Senior VP, knows how long it takes to fight to make the world fur-free. Just about his whole PETA career, more than 3 decades. His activism resume is like a history of animal rights, from civil disobedience to its impact on consumers. I talked to Dan on how everything has changed for the good when it comes to fur. So much so that it means a victory for PETA activists who often put their bodies on the line. My conversation with Dan Mathews on the PETA Podcast.
So Dan, what are you doing these days? What's the latest?
I just got back from a whirlwind trip overseas in Europe. I was in Milan meeting with a lot of our former targets, people whose runway shows we used to disrupt over fur, like Prada and Versace and Armani. And now they've all moved past fur. They've dropped fur, and they are open ears to hear about vegan leather, vegan wool, soy cashmere, all these things. And it was kind of bittersweet because obviously the strides are incredible, and it's so heartening to see that these things really, really do change. But I kind of miss the Italian jails.
Yeah, that's so well because they have nicer toiletries, or what?
Well, of course, Italian cops are among the hottest. You have to say.
Yeah.
Have to lay that out there.
I can see that, maybe. Yeah.
And it just was really thrilling to see, hundreds of people at a fashion show sit up and take notice that this thing wasn't acceptable. I mean, it's so it's historic that it's all turned around. It's wonderful. But of course, the activist in you misses that charge. It's not the same charge you get from wearing a suit and a tie and bringing a portfolio of vegan fabrics. It's nice, but it's just not the same electric charge.
Let's stop here for a moment, because this is, like you said, it's an historic thing. Years past, you'd go there, these would be your targets. They would try to avoid you. They'd have the cops arrest you. You'd go to the jail, like you said, very nostalgic. And now they're your friends? They're like talking to you like a normal person?
Yes. And in fact, it was interesting. Armani actually met with us a year ago. And when we met with Armani a year ago, they were very non-committal. They were, confirmed, no more fur. But we don't know about the rest of the stuff. We've got to look into it. And it was they were a little bit defensive, but very, very polite. And now a year later, there were 2 new staffers there, both of whom had been hired to source more sustainable and more vegan fabrics. And so their companies moved right along, and not only did I have samples for them, they had prototypes to show us of vegan leather bags, and they were very, very excited, very enthusiastic about it. We met with the second in command at the company, and it was great. It's just the way it's supposed to be. Prada refused to meet with us before, as had Versace. They were both big PETA targets for many, many years. And Versace was pretty new to the game as far as looking at beyond fur at other vegan fabrics. Prada, they were very open about how they knew they were doing a lot of things that were wrong, and they didn't know how they would be corrected. It took them a long while to ditch fur because they said they had to reshuffle so many employees who were involved just in the making of fur that they didn't want to fire, and they had to reshuffle into different parts of the company. They were very, very forthright about where they stand. A woman brought both of her dogs to work, and they're now ready to look at taking the next steps. I don't know how long that'll take. Hopefully it'll be sooner than later, but the communication, which was so absent before because they just dug their head in the sand, is now really emerging. It's very exciting to see.
What do you think it was? Is it just that the market, they caught up to the market, or the market caught up with them and forced them to change, and they saw that for them to be a sustainable company, they had to change with the times? Really,
I think in the last 3 years, ever since Gucci swore off fur and he said fur was not modern and made such a good declaration about it, and then Michael Kors jumped ship, I really think that it's been like the Titanic. Nobody wants to be the last person to jump off. And so they've all been scrambling to not be the last ones using fur. The big holdouts are Dolce & Gabbana. I don't know when they will finally make a declaration, but they have fallen from favor for a number of reasons, in addition to being furry. I think it's, and if you even take a step further back into the 90s, we used to write all these designers, send them the videotapes even before the times of the DVD and links, and ask them to watch the videotape and meet with us to discuss phasing out fur. They would not even reply. They would not acknowledge that they received the packages. They wanted nothing to do with us at all, and that's why we started occupying designers' offices. The first one we occupied was Calvin Klein in 1994. About a dozen of us were arrested occupying his office after he refused to meet. And then he did agree to meet, and he did watch the video, and he did a joint statement with us, which hit the New York Times and Women's Wear Daily, that he was getting out of the fur trade because of what they did to animals. And that really started the ball rolling in 94. It's a shame that it took 25 years for everyone else to catch up with Calvin, but at least we're just about there now.
So looking back and to see that, it took 25 years and to see what the things that had to happen to change in that generation. On the one hand, you're happy that it happened, but what kind of thoughts do you have about the fight that you waged?
To look at it from a little bit of a broader historical view, these companies, especially the foreign ones, had been in the fur trade since the 60s, since the 50s even, some of them. This goes back decades before PETA was ever around. This was a thing that people aspired to have if they had money. And of course, people who grew up in the post-World War II era, this was the thing to show that you had made it. In fact, a lot of the actresses who had done the mink ads, the Black Glamour, What Becomes a Legend Most, some of them were people who later became our spokespeople, including Brigitte Bardot. Cher had done one of those ads. Now she's a ferocious anti-fur advocate. So I think it's just interesting to see the whole cultural turnabout. But it really, what started in the 50s and 60s is now all being finished now. And there was, of course, a lot of work that happened in the middle years. But to take away what was a key component of these global fashion houses' business, it took longer than we hoped, but it has happened. And I think alarming them, making them nervous to even put on a fur fashion show through the threat of disruptions was very instrumental. And then I think, as with all of these things, it's a generational change. They realized it wasn't just a trend among some young people, but that most of the new generation thought fur was revolting, and it wasn't just a passing trend. I think Stella McCartney deciding to be a high fashion brand and doing it without using any fur or any leather ever also showed them that there's a market for it, and that they were going to be really behind if they didn't start to play catch up.
It's great that it happened, but bittersweet because, like you said earlier, You miss those Italian jails. Getting arrested was part of the strategy.
In these days of social media, and you launch your protest by liking or sending a thing to a post, it really highlights the difference between that and putting your body on the line for something. And I feel very lucky to have been a part of the time when you actually could throw your body into the mix and disrupt a fur fashion show or occupy a designer's office. And I hope that we still will do some things like that. I'm sure we will. It's a different era now, of course. Every era changes. But there was something pretty special about that.
You had these Italian jails that you joke about liking. I'm sure you liked a little bit about it.
It's not really a joke. I really did like them. I mean, my favorite. I actually wrote a connoisseur's guide to the world's jails, where I rated each jail for food, hospitality, accommodation, whether they allow you to primp before taking your mugshot or not. And I think they were fascinating. Of course, the police have a lot of real, true hardened criminals to deal with, so we were kind of like a day off for them. So I was always treated fairly well. I never really had a bad experience.
What was the best experience and what was the worst experience?
I think my favorite jail was probably Hong Kong. It was in the 90s during an international fur convention there, and it was my friend Julie and I doing one of the early Rather Go Naked Than Wear fur protests, and we knew that it was illegal to be nude in Hong Kong or to be without your passport in Hong Kong. So we sewed our passports into our boxers, but when we stripped down to our boxers, the police came swooping up behind us, threw blankets over our head, and dragged us to jail. And they tried to charge us with being naked and being without our documents, but neither charge could stick because we had both. But they were very kind. They brought in bok choy and other vegan stuff for us to eat in jail. And then because we didn't have any other clothes, they gave us Hong Kong PD T-shirts to wear when we were released. And so what tourist gets that?
They're very accommodating, those Hong Kong police. This is before Beijing or before the handover, right?
It was, well before the handover. Some of the local animal people were not thrilled with the whole naked tactic. They thought it was demeaning, and we said, if you've got any other ideas of how to put this issue on the front page, we're all ears. And they said, well, you could get caned. You could get beaten with a wooden cane for indecent exposure. Yeah. And Julie and I thought, oh, wow, that would really give us a great talking point. We got away with bruises, but these animals get skinned alive. But they didn't end up caning us. They just brought us food and gave us Hong Kong PD T-shirts.
Too civil, those folks there. Well, all right, so what was the worst?
Chicago. And that was, it's a pretty rough place. The Chicago jails, there was not a roof between the cells, and people would throw things over, and they would get caught up on a fence that was like a chain link fence that was above you, and it was not easy to go to sleep when you would look up and see dirty toilet paper hanging from the grid above your head that somebody had tossed from the next cell. It was very cold, but luckily we were only in for I think about 10 hours.
Yeah. Now you mentioned it's a different time. And you talk about the old days when you had to put your body on the line, and you kind of missed that it was important. And nowadays there's social media. Is it more effective when you put your body on the line versus these more, say, distant, ways where people can participate from far away and not be too involved? How do you think the old way and the new way compare?
Well, it's certainly more invigorating to do something physically. You really get a sense of you've done all that you could do. You brought the battle to them literally in a way that they had to call the police to drag you away. And there's a place and a time for that in all the different campaigns. People still get arrested now, sometimes at SeaWorld and other issues. So those days aren't completely done. I think in the fashion world, they're just as far as fur is concerned, it's pretty much mission accomplished. Although there are some holdouts, obviously Canada Goose and Dolce and Gabbana, and in Italy the Fendi brand still is very furry. So it's not all the rage like it once was to do civil disobedience. It's just done more sparingly now.
As you were going over that history list of companies that have adopted, a no-fur policy, just recently Macy's has said they will end fur sales, and that was one of your early campaigns. When you see something like that happen, is it gratifying to someone like yourself who's been at this for a while still to see that, that company like Macy's is saying, hey, no, we're not going to sell fur?
The Macy's turnabout was completely historic. I would consider Macy's the number one target dating back to the 80s, and they never budged. There was protests where, God, I remember at one point in the 80s we encircled Macy's and blocked every entrance and were arrested. And that was one of my early PETA trips to New York, and I was staying with friends, and I said, well, I'm staying with you, but I will be in jail tonight, so I'm not sure that I'll actually be back, but I'll let you know. And of course, this is before you could text somebody to say that you were okay or whatever. So yeah, that was really thrilling. It was great to see that happen, and it was a bit of a surprise too. They've been targeted with Fur-Free Friday protests for so long, and we've protested in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Protested at the Macy's shareholder meeting. There was a lot that went into that over many, 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 many years, over 3 decades. So it was a real coup when that happened so recently.
We talk about getting arrested and protesting, and there is this time-honored activity, civil disobedience, that animal rights is a part of. Do you think that the younger activists have lose out a bit when it seems that everything is about marketing and the social media and that kind of thing?
Well, I was really happy to see Jane Fonda move to Washington so that she could take part in civil disobedience in the climate protests recently. So I think it still exists out there with different issues. It's just it's not as much the same way with animal rights as it once was, although it still does happen. It still does happen sometimes.
And I also noticed that I think it was on the PETA website, there was talk about gays and the movement and gay rights issues, and you had something that I found very touching and historic, talking about the involvement of gays and the animal rights movement, because it seems like there's a lot of people who forget that there's an historical link to with all the civil rights movements and animal rights. Can you tell me about that thing that I saw? Was it a documentary or some kind of piece that you did? What was it?
Well, I think it's interesting. The two issues which have really had an evolution in the past 30 years, the two movements that I think have probably had the most success are gay rights and animal rights. And I think I don't know exactly why that is when other movements have stalled or not become as entrenched in culture as gay rights and animal rights. But I think there's a lot of similarities. There's of course always been a big overlap. I'm just one of many gay animal advocates who's also been very involved in the gay rights movement, and I think especially when you look back, like at the 80s, there was this sense of being an outsider and of this whole culture that was not even acknowledging your existence or denigrating it. And it was the same if you were a vegetarian. It was the same if you were a gay. There was kind of a social stigma, and I think that outsider outlook is what drove a lot of people to be involved in each of these movements, and to see them become mainstream, especially in the past decade, has been a absolute thrill. It's been phenomenal, and of course the two things that we have that are different is animal rights is more of a consumer movement. It's about all the things we eat and the products we buy and the clothes we wear, whereas gay rights is just people living their own honest lives rather than hiding and being in the closet. So it's more of a lifestyle thing, not a lifestyle choice, but just being open about your lifestyle, and that's a daily thing. So I think maybe those are the reasons why is because they're not so attached to politics as other issues are, because it's more about lifestyle and consumer issues.
Yeah, but you were compelled to put together this piece as a kind of reminder to the current day activists or the present day activists that, of the evolution. Why did you feel compelled to do it?
I don't know. I think we just all have to, things happen so gradually, and I think when you look back beyond your own time into like the decade, what led up to it, you have to realize that these things didn't just happen on their own. They took people moving heaven and earth and putting themselves on the line and risking a lot personally and professionally and socially to get people to pay attention to these issues and allow the changes to happen. When
you did this history and talked about this link between gay rights and animal rights and the things that have happened prior to, the present day, how did it make you feel when you got it off your chest and you shared it with others?
Well, I think, it's easy for all of us to kind of be trapped in our own era and not realize what led up to it. So I think it's good to connect the dots. My degree was in history, and I always felt it was interesting to find out what allowed some movements to succeed and what kept other movements back. So I think it's always important to look at that sort of thing, and especially when there's movements that have such a parallel time frame as gay rights and animal rights. I think you can't miss it. You've got to look at that.
Well, you've done so much. Just looking at your bio and all the things that you've done, and you always did it with a flair and always did it with a certain amount of celebrity, and that's still the case. You still are, have the knack of getting together all the right people at the right time for the right cause. What is it about celebrity and animal rights that make it an almost unbeatable combination when you put together a campaign or put together an effort to try to change people's minds about animal rights?
Well, I think when you have a celebrity involved, it makes people that feel like they're the only one that feels that way about animal rights. They're the only vegan in their family. They feel a little shy about speaking up sometimes. If there's a celebrity, especially a strong one like Pink or Bill Maher or somebody who is just not afraid to say what they mean, I think it gives people some courage. I think it gives them it helps give them a little backbone in speaking out themselves. So I think there's that element to it. And then the other element is it's a great icebreaker. If somebody who may not agree with the issues or doesn't really see eye to eye with the vegan outlook, the vegan philosophy, when you add a celebrity to the mix, it adds a lot of ammo to our side, just because people look at that and think, and I'm not saying that that's right, but it does give more credence to things. It makes the issue seem more relevant. And especially when, we've done a lot of work with different TV shows over the years, getting animal rights issues on in sitcoms or in other, crime dramas, and just making it relevant. There's a lot of different things people are paying attention to, and if you can make animal rights one of those things that is unmissable, whether you're watching the news or watching a movie or a TV sitcom, it just makes all the difference in the world to be relevant.
You have made getting arrested being part of your MO. Are there celebrities that you've been arrested with that have been particularly memorable for you?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is most of the celebrities I've been arrested with are women. And so one of the things that happens when you get arrested is they separate the boys from the girls. And so, I can't tell you whether it's been with Chrissy Hind or the Go-Go's or more recently Sarah Gilbert, Ricky Lake. You get separated from your good friends, which is a bummer. I've often been the only guy arrested, which is kind of a drag. But then at the same time, you get thrown in with people that you get to educate in your own way, in your own cell.
Well, that's sad that you get. I didn't even consider that. If you get if you get arrested with Chrissy Hind, or how about Pamela Anderson? If you've ever been arrested with Pamela Anderson?
I should have been arrested with Pamela, but luckily we got away with whatever it was that we were doing.
But it just dawned on me that if you were arrested with one of your celebrity cohorts, you'd have to be separated if they're female, and then you'd be all alone. And I
never really mind that. I mean, whenever I've been in jail, I find the most interesting thing is listening to everybody else's story, and that's the one place it's one of the only places I'm usually silent is when I'm in a holding cell, because you get to really hear all these great stories that you would otherwise only hear on, Law and Order or something like that. But I remember in New York, and especially if people would find out that you actually were arrested as a protester, you're a little nervous that they're going to say, oh, hey, and give you a hard time, or, you see people get, pushed around or whatever. So I just generally clam up. But once in New York, when we had raided Karl Lagerfeld's office, I didn't say anything about why we had been in jail because I was the only guy on that side. And then I was being let out. The news came on, and there was a TV near the holding cell area, and there we were on the news. And then all of my cellmates saw that, and they just cheered, and one of them screamed, "Power to the SEALs!" And I thought, wow, that was really nice postscript to that time in that cell.
Solidarity.
That's right.
All these things you've done, you've made changes, and you come back from Europe, things are changing there. So really, what is next? It's not as exciting, or is there more exciting things ahead because people are adopting soy and vegan leather and all that, all these new materials?
Well, it is a different world now. My last stop on my trip this last week was in Stockholm for some meetings with H&M about vegan fashion. And the last time I was in Stockholm was probably 15 years ago, and there was nothing to eat for a vegan. I mean, you had to go to an Indian restaurant or an Italian restaurant. It was really difficult. Now, every restaurant not only had a vegan item, they had entire vegan sections on the menu. And I'm talking from fast food places to high-end hotel restaurants that you would pass in the street. And I've never seen a more complete revolution than in Stockholm, which is just the last place you would expect it. Similar things are happening in France now, other countries that were holdouts. I think the challenge now is that fur was such an obnoxious thing. There was the class issue involved, the idea that somebody would pay thousands of dollars for a coat that consumed the lives of 120 animals. That was easy to point out to a lot of people. I think leather and wool are more subtle issues. There's not the class aspect involved, and so I think that's going to be a bigger challenge to us. But at the same time, there's fashion brands that are embracing vegan leather and trying it out, and people are realizing that you just look for cotton and poly and viscose sweaters, things like that. You have to look a little harder, but it's a little more subtle. So I think that's going to be the challenge in the next fashion wars.
So the new era begins, and what's going to continue to motivate you as you continue on? I don't suppose you're considering ever leaving the activist realm.
No,
right?
No. I mean, it's funny because I've been with PETA 34 years now, and for so long you just have the outlook of, well, we're going to be the outside agitators. That's just the way it's going to be, because it was like that for 10 years, then 20 years, then things started to change, and now all of a sudden we're seeing the fruits of our labor, especially going back to the early days where things are so different now. So I think you have to change with the times, and it's just like 60s activism really didn't work in the 80s. 80s activism doesn't really work in the 2000s. It's tactics change as times change. And I think that's the most important thing, is being aware of that and constantly evolving with ways to motivate people.
So how about yourself? What is it going to take to motivate or to continue to motivate you? I guess the animals as always, or?
Oh yeah, it's always that. Yeah. I think that's not the issue at all. It's just a matter of recognizing what it is that people are moved by. Of course, in the supermodel era, they were moved by beauty and sex appeal and fashion, things like that. Now we're in a bit of a different era, and now there's also so many other distractions in the world with the government turning upside down, and there's always distractions for people's attention. And so our big goal is to try to figure out how to make people see what's happening to animals as an urgent crisis as well, and to never let that be invisible. And that's the magic of PETA, is we always somehow manage to do that.
And so what moves people is simply making the animals visible in their plight, right?
That's right. Because I think once people recognize that, it's an easy battle. The thing is that people have a hard time acknowledging what happens to animals and really digesting the cruelty involved in all these industries. But once they do, it's people make the change, and we've seen that bear out now. I mean, Burger King just released their profits for the last quarter, and it was the biggest surge in 1 quarter sales they've had in 4 years because of the Impossible Whopper. And who would have ever thought before that there would be Burger King national ads about a vegan Whopper that would look like something we might have considered running in the 90s. It's just the world has caught up with us in terms of vegan eating. Now we just have to make that translate into the fashion world as well.
And all other realms that that PETA continues to protest on behalf of the animals. And Dan, I really appreciate your time. I've known you for some time. From I think the first time I met you, you're wearing an Uncle Sam outfit in protest in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Thank you for sharing your time today on the PETA Podcast.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's my pleasure. Always good to talk to you.
Dan Mathews, PETA Senior VP, on the changes in the fashion world and on his own life as an activist more than 3 decades long at PETA. So there's victory on the fashion front, but still some fashion holdouts. Find out more. Go to PETA.org. And that's our program. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog, or on amok.com, AMOK.com. Hey, all these ways to reach me. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.